Many of the surveys have shown that one of the biggest reasons why people leave religion is that they feel that there is a conflict between science and religion, and that they've chosen science, thinking that religion was used to come up with answers for things when there was no science. And one of the things that we have to look at is to try and say, as people of faith, how do we answer when people say that they've chosen science over religion? How do we show that there's no conflict, that truth is truth? As we do that, we can help them understand that there's no reason to reject religion and spirituality in place of science. What is faith? One good explanation we see in Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. So we can see that faith isn't for what can be seen. For instance, we don't need faith to know that we're sitting at St. Eugene's in Asheville today. Faith is for things that we can't see with our senses and what's in front of us. So one of the things that people will say is, I will believe in God when you can prove to me that he exists. And when they say that, they often mean when you can prove through the physical sciences that God exists. But let's take that a step back. Sometimes we can look and see that in our history, there have been things that we could not prove, but we later proved that they existed, but they existed even before it was proven. Let's look at gravity. Gravity was discovered by Isaac Newton, and in fact he came up with the formulas that described how fast something would fall from the air based off of the forces of gravity. But gravity existed long before Isaac Newton discovered it. Let's look at another example, quarks, which have been discovered by the Large Hadron Collider that we see in Europe. But yet Einstein, many years earlier, had said that something like quarks had to exist because of the way that he observed that molecules interacted with each other. So Einstein, through what he could observe, knew that something like quarks had to exist, and then they were in fact proven by the Large Hadron Collider. But we have to understand that it existed before it was proven. Let's look a little bit into the future. Dark matter. Well, astrophysicists have said that dark matter has to exist, even though we don't really even know how to describe it, and we can't prove that it exists, but through observances we can see that it has to exist. So just because something cannot be proven by the physical sciences yet doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So let's look at this idea of being able to determine that something exists based off of what we can observe, not necessarily what can be proven by the physical sciences. An example of this would be the quarks, like Einstein had come up with. Now, Thomas Aquinas gave us his classic arguments proving the existence of God. I won't try to go through all of them, but let's look at his argument from contingency. This would basically be, if you see a flower that's growing, how did that flower come into being? The seed started growing when it came into contact with rain that made it start growing and then continue to grow until it bloomed. Well, where did the rain come from? Well, it came from humidity in the air, and there was too much humidity, it fell to earth in the form of rain. So where did the humidity come from? Well, that came from heat that heated up the water in rivers, lakes, and oceans that went up into the air. Where did the heat come from? Well, that comes from the fusion reaction of the sun, and then you could say, well, where did the sun come from? And that came from an agglomeration of matter that through gravity brought it all together and started the fusion reaction. Now, where did all this matter come from? Well, that came from the Big Bang, where all matter in the universe originally came from. Now, the idea here is that everything that we see in Earth is contingent on something else being there. The flower doesn't exist without the rain. The rain doesn't exist without humidity, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, that's an argument that is not compelling, because everything cannot continue to go backwards. There has to be something, someone who had no beginning, was not contingent on anything else, who had no yesterday. And that is God. By his very nature, had no beginning, was not contingent on anyone else. So let's look at how science and religion are not opposed. Now, in the 1950s, and you'll see why I picked that date, it was illegal to teach evolution in our public schools. It was illegal before 1950, but back then only biblical creation could be taught. And in fact, it wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court ended that ruling. So what about the church? In 1950, Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis said that we cannot dismiss the theory of evolution, that it answers many of the questions that we see, that we can observe, and he says the theory has merit. So what's the takeaway from this? That the church, even when our secular society said we cannot contradict the biblical story of creation, said there is no conflict between science and religion. Now, decades later, Pope John Paul II, in his address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, this Vatican Academy was reestablished to help promote the sciences, to serve the truth, with the understanding that there will be a fruitful dialogue between the church and science. So what did John Paul II talk about at this academy? He talked about the origin of life, and he talked about how scientific discipline and divine revelation, there can seem to be a clash, and we see that in surveys that we saw in the video. But he's saying that there can't be a contradiction, because truth cannot contradict truth. He was quoting his predecessor, Leo XIII. And he said that the church can better expand her work with scientific knowledge. He said that science can help us look at things that are observable, that respond to our physical world. But he said only the church can discern moral behavior. Science cannot do that. So he talked about evolution, and he invoked his predecessor, Pius XII, and said definitively there is no conflict with evolution. He also talked about the idea that we have to set limits on how we understand Scripture. All of us are not expected to come up with our own understanding of Scripture, that there is a right way of doing this. And he said that scientific research helps us in this understanding. How is that? Well, we can look at the explosion in the science of anthropology and even physics with carbon dating that helps us understand how the people of Jesus' time lived, what their culture was like. And it's helped us to date documents that we found so that we can understand what was the original intent of the authors of Scripture, so that we can get the understanding that was meant for us today. John Paul II also talked about that evolution touches on the conception of man, how our physical body came about. But that doesn't deny that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and that because of that we have our own value. Now, our body comes from living matter, but our soul is created directly by God. And he says that science observes and measures, but the spirit cannot be observed in that way. Our soul, which is spiritual, cannot be measured by what science does. Theology helps us to clarify what science has observed. I want you to look at this picture in the upper left, and this was at the Solvay conference in the 1920s, which brought together the top scientists in the world at that time. Now you see on the right the guy named Einstein that many of us recognize, but in the middle is Father Georges Lemay, who was a Catholic priest and an eminent world-class physicist, an astrophysicist. Father Lemay was the first to theorize the idea of an expanding universe, that the universe was going ever outward. He's also the first person that proposed the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. Get that. When people tell us that science and religion are opposed, we can tell them that a Catholic priest is the one who came up with the Big Bang theory. So Einstein looked at what Father Lemay had said, and he told him, your calculations are correct, but your physics are atrocious. Now you might think that Lemay might think, oh, Einstein disagrees with me. Maybe I should go back and rethink what I've said. But he didn't. He knew that his science was good. And later, his work was agreed with by Hubble, who the Hubble telescope was named after. And then, after many other people started agreeing with Father Lemay, Einstein later came back and said, this is the most beautiful and satisfactory explanation of creation to which I have ever listened. What's the conclusion? Father Lemay saw no conflict between science and religion. We should feel confident when we talk to people and say there is no conflict between science and religion. Next, we're going to look at a video that Bishop Barron has put together on science and religion.
Let the sciences advance. As a religious person, I have zero hesitancy about any of the sciences. Let them get into the end zone, do all they can do. It's not going to undermine what we mean by authentic religion. In fact, it's going to confirm it.
Across all religious groups, so not just Catholicism, but all religious groups, 59% of people agree with the statement that religion and science are in conflict with one another. So roughly 60% of religious people, not just atheists, agnostics, but religious people think faith and science are in conflict. You cited two specific anecdotes. I want to read these. One was from an anonymous male, age 37. He said, now, I wonder if a God really exists. I believe God was once used to explain phenomena which can now be explained by science. And then a second anecdote from a female, age 18. She said, in all honesty, I feel religion is an outdated notion. And now that we have such scientific advances, we no longer need a higher being to explain how we came to be on the earth. I now put my faith in science. As a Catholic bishop, how do you react to this?
I react that it's tragic nonsense. And, you know, I'll put the onus on us to a degree here. God knows the culture propagates this nonsense a lot. But we've been terrible, frankly, at explaining properly this relationship, explaining why there's no conflict between religion and science. Just think of those two statements. The number of fallacies and inaccuracies and stupidities are extraordinary. But that no teacher along the line sufficiently got through to those people to say, no, that's not the right way to think about this at all. They're both falling into this sort of old, God of the gaps thing, which is so much nonsense, has nothing to do with what serious theists have maintained over the centuries. And our own people, think of, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Newman, our greatest intellectuals are exceptionally good on all of this. But we've been exceptionally bad at articulating our own intellectual tradition.
The first one was science comes from religion. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, first I meant making an historical point and then a theoretical point. Historically, simply this, that all the great founders of the modern sciences were educated in schools sponsored by the church. So as John Paul II said, the university system came ex corde ecclesiae. It came from the heart of the church. So think of all the great founders, from Newton and Kepler and Galileo himself and Descartes and company. They all would have learned their mathematics and their basic physics and their astronomy in church-sponsored universities. Galileo is a deeply religious man in dialogue with some of the leading religious figures of the time. And so, just historically speaking, the great scientists came up out of a church matrix, a church environment. But secondly, and more importantly, the theoretical side of it, and I've argued this before, there are two things that are really needed for science as we know it to get off the ground. First, that the world, or nature, is not God. If you think the world is nature, or the nature is divine, and a lot of people do, both ancient and modern, right? Think of the ancient peoples who worshipped mountains and the clouds and the planets and so on. Think of environmentalists today on the extreme side who basically divinize nature. Well, if you're in that stance, you're not going to empirically analyze and dissect and take apart nature in the sort of experimental mode. You're going to worship it from a distance. But once you know the world is not God, well, then you're free to analyze it that way. Secondly, every scientist must assume that the world that he or she goes out to meet is intelligible. It's endowed with some kind of patterned meaning that corresponds to an inquiring mind. Otherwise, you'd never get biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, psychology off the ground, right? They all depend on logos, like biology, psychology, etc. That there's a logos out there to meet the inquiring mind. Where do those two ideas come from? That the world is not God, and the world is imbued, endowed in every nook and cranny with intelligibility. It comes from the doctrine of creation, right? That God made something other than himself, and he endowed it with intelligibility because God spoke it, as it were, into being. When those two ideas are in place, you have the matrix out of which the modern sciences can come.
Principle number 2 is that these two fields, religion and science, are not in competition. Say more about that.
It's very important. The sciences deal with the things and objects and events and relationships within the empirically verifiable universe. That's the definition of science, because the scientific method rests upon empirical observation, followed by hypothesis formation, followed by experimentation, followed by the drawing of conclusions, right? So it begins with the empirically verifiable world. It has to. That's its arena. God is not an item or object or thing within the universe. Now, why? Because he's a fantasy? No, because he's the creator that's behind the totality of the physical universe. God's not a thing in the world. Rather, God's the reason why there is a world at all. I just think of Harry Potter. So there's this wildly complex story with all these characters. There's Harry himself and Hermione and what's the other kid's name?
Ron.
And you've got Professor Snape, and you've got Voldemort, and you've got Hogwarts, and you got all these plots and subplots in this really densely complex universe. Where in that universe, I said to them, is J.K. Rowling? Where is she? Well, she's nowhere. She's not a character in the story. You don't. She's not going to come into the room and start talking to Harry Potter. But then I said, where is J.K. Rowling? Well, she's everywhere in the story. She's behind every bit of it. She thought that whole world into being. The big characters, the real little characters, the main plots, all the subplots. Every bit of it is under her providence, so to speak, right? I said, that's an analogy for the way God relates to the world. He's not in the world, so a scientist isn't going to find him. Or look, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence for God? Well, that's silly. But God is the reason why there is an empirically verifiable world at all. Right? And so that's why I say, in this way, they're not like two football teams on the same field. As one team advances, the other retreats. It has to go that way, right? They're competing on the same turf. One scores a touchdown, the other one has to totally give way. So people think of science and religion that way, like in those quotes. Oh yeah, we used to have religion, used to be way over here. They were like on the 25-yard line of science. Then science keeps advancing and religion has to retreat. And now science is won, we don't need religion. Well, that's stupid. They're not competing on the same field. Rather, they're both rational forms talking about different dimensions of reality. Scientism is a philosophical point of view. It's a bit like naturalism, right, or materialism, which aren't science. Those are philosophical perspectives. So scientism says the only legitimate way to know truth is through the scientific method. So I'm reducing all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. Now, notice something right away. It's operationally self-contradictory. It undermines itself because where precisely or how precisely do you scientifically verify the fact that only scientific method gives you truth? You've just shared a truth that was not derived from the scientific method as you're claiming it's only through the scientific method that I know the truth. And so it's on the face of it an absurdity. And it's philosophical claim that is saying the only legitimate claims are scientific claims. And so it's just operationally self-contradictory. But then the deeper problem is this. It's such an impoverishment. And I reached out to these kids like this, like, you guys don't fall for this nonsense because it reduces your life so dramatically. I said, how many of you guys are reading Shakespeare right now? Well, a lot of hands went up, and Romeo and Juliet, which a lot of high school kids read, Julius Caesar, some Macbeth. I said, terrific, I'm delighted. I said, do you think those plays tell you anything true about life and relationships and love and ambition? And of course, they're high school kids, so they won't tell me. But I said, of course they do. They're telling you truths, but they're not scientific truths. They're not given to you by the scientific method. But that doesn't mean they're not speaking truth. So I said, don't accept this gross impoverishment of your spirit, which scientism is offering to you. So, right, all the way with science, love it. Scientism, hate it. And don't conflate the two.
Let's look at the fourth one. You said that Galileo is only a small part of the story.
Yeah. The Galileo story in itself, the standard telling is, courageous scientist who's overthrowing this old model and saying the Copernican model is correct. And he was opposed by obscurantist and backward-looking religious fundamentalists who used their power to suppress him and in fact, imprison him. And so that's what religion does, is it tries to block the progress of the sciences. I said, you guys know that story, huh? And I said, okay, look, first of all, I'm not going to talk about the details of Galileo, but trust me when I tell you, even that story is a lot more complicated than the little caricature that I laid out. But I said, let's just say for sake of argument, Galileo was not the church's best moment. And I said, John Paul II, in fact, apologized for the way Galileo was treated. So let's just say it's not the church's best moment. But I said, it's one paragraph in one very long chapter of an even longer book. And we need to know the other stories and characters in that book. And then I just began going through a number of them. From Copernicus himself, right, who's a third-order Dominican and the one who gave us the view of the universe that Galileo was defending. Trained in church universities, fostered by the church in different ways. I talked about Nicola Steno, didn't I? I think who was the founder of modern geology, a man who later in life becomes a priest and a bishop. I mentioned Louis Pasteur, who's the pasteurization and really the founder of microbiology. A very devout Catholic layman who saw his work in union with the church. Gregor Mendel, I mentioned, the founder of modern genetics, Augustinian friar who did his work in the monastery garden. One of my favorite examples, of course, Georges Lemaitre, Belgian astrophysicist, astronomer, educated at the leading university at the time, colleague of Einstein, et cetera, and the formulator of the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins that almost everybody accepts today, and Catholic priest. I still think an awful lot of Catholics don't even know that. One of the great scientists of the 20th century was a Catholic priest. My point being, and I put all these pictures up, on the wall, there's more to this story than Galileo. In fact, there's a very rich narrative of the church people, ardently believing Catholics who were deeply involved in the sciences. And so witnessed by their lives to the fact that there oughtn't to be a conflict between the two of them.
Call it the Kalam argument. How does that go?
That's a famous one that William Lane Craig has kind of revived. It goes back to the Middle Ages. Kalam is an Islamic term that just means, I think, word or speech, right? can be very simply stated. Whatever comes into being has a cause, first premise. Second premise, the universe came into being. We know that from Georges Lemaitre, right? Conclusion, the universe must have had a cause. Now, we can debate all those and watch William Lane Craig's videos for all the details. But I said, though the sciences cannot in themselves adjudicate the question of God, because I just laid out a philosophical argument, not a scientific one. Nevertheless, I said, the sciences provided premise number 2. Because Thomas Aquinas didn't know that. Thomas didn't know on scientific grounds that the world had a beginning, which is why he didn't embrace that argument in the Middle Ages. But we know it now, that space, time, energy, matter at one time came into being. We speculate about 13.5 billion years ago, right? Well, if that's true, it came into being, then it must have had a cause. Now, press it, I said to the kids. What's the nature of that cause? Well, it's the cause of matter and energy and space and time. Therefore, it's not caught in those categories. It's antecedent to or prior to matter, space, time, energy. Therefore, this cause must be eternal, outside of time. It must be spiritual or immaterial, outside of matter. It must be infinite, because it's not caught up in space. More to it, since it endowed the entire world with intelligibility, it must be an intelligent and personal power. So we've got an intelligent, personal, eternal, overwhelmingly powerful, spiritual reality that caused the universe. The Kalam argument, in its kind of simplicity and elegance, gives us very, I think, convincing, rational grounds for believing in the God revealed in the Bible. Get past the competitive view. These are not two teams on the same football field. And so let the sciences advance. As a religious person, I have zero hesitancy about any of the sciences. Let them get into the end zone, do all they can do. It's not going to undermine what we mean by authentic religion. In fact, it's going to confirm it. So I'd say get beyond this competitive view of the two of them.